I wanted to start out of the gate today because there is so much ground, as always, to cover with you here. Kamadeva shoots an arrow at Shiva. Why? What's going on? And what does that teach us? This parable.
Well, it's one of the beautiful Puranic myths of encounter of what could be kind of like seen as a mischievous, flamboyant god. In Western Hemisphere, in Western culture, he's known as Eros, and in Indian lore, he's known as Kamadeva, right? Literally, Kama, pleasure, Deva, right? The god of pleasure, desire, right? And in his kind of one of his mischiefs, he thought, well, why don't I shoot an arrow at Shiva, right? And Alpha and Omega of it all, whilst Shiva was in meditation. So, of course, Shiva interjected that internally with his inner sight, even though he had his eyes closed, so to speak, but he could clearly see it with his third eye. And so just as Kamadeva was to release the arrow, basically to slay Shiva with the pangs of love, because that's the whole point, right? And if Kamadeva hits the target, then he will make someone in love with someone else, with something else. That's the whole point. And instead, he was pulverized, and, he was just extinguished there and then. So, of course, Shiva's spouse, Parvati, she interfered, and she was like adamant that, you restore, even though a lesser god, back to life, otherwise, universe will be deprived of love, man. You are God, right? But hey, that's not going to fly here. And Shiva was like foreseeing that Parvati is adamant. She's going to throw a tantrum on a cosmic scale. She just like, well, I can't really restore him because after all, I'm Shiva and I'm here to dissolve everything, right? So that, that's what I do. That's my prose, right? She insisted, so he allowed Kamadeva be, but only as a vapor at the very, very ground of existence. So, in other words, the Kamadeva's essence entered the subatomic particles, speaking our language of today. And so the god of love, the god of pleasure, is really, really the air we breathe. So that myth literally is very profound. When I first came across that, it literally slayed me with the very arrow of its directness, in the sense of what it pointed out to. And somehow it was also a reconfirmation of something that we all know deep down. And we know it at very different levels. At times we are terrified by the sheer revelation that it brings. At other times it may serve as a kind of legitimizing our desire to revel in the world of experiences and in the world of desires. At other times, it points also to the impossibility of discarding desire, because it's fundamentally it's at the core, at the essence of the entire creation, because that's what the myth points out. So I used to bring that. It's funny that you dug out that bit, because I used to bring that quite often to the settings of our programs, but I haven't done it for a while. So thank you for an opportunity to revisit that. I even just to add, there was this years ago. I remember coming across a quote from Pablo Picasso that all art is erotic. And I thought, I'm going to give it a spin and I'm going to make a post of my own. And this we're talking about like some 12, 15 years ago, maybe more. And so I did like a little kind of so Picasso said all art is erotic. And Tantra goes even further. All experiences are erotic. And this myth, a reconfirmation of that. In other words, Eros here often narrowly misunderstood to be extended to certain experiences. We call them, we deem and dub as erotic experiences. Whereas in fact, anytime there is a contact of the subject with object through the sense perception, it is an erotic act. And this in itself is a reflection also of another tantric axiom, that the matrix of creation itself is woven between these energies, which is the embrace of Shiva and Shakti, which we talk about in our first initial conversation, where that dynamic tension, that creative tension, is due to that embrace, the embrace of the eminent and its own power, which comes in waves of resonance. And this resonance is the universe we live and breathe.
It's quite profound to expand out the interface between two when one is penetrating the other, and it's not actually about appendages. Sorry for me for bringing it back to the crude sense, but there's so much there's so much reductionist, and I think even in our last conversation we spent so much time talking about Maya and how in the West it's just so quickly reduced into the word illusion, and we attempted to unpack using English what this one word really represents. There's this piece in the parable that I wanted to sort of pull on the thread a little bit, if that's okay. Is I like you, the vapor being present in all things, and the inherent desire within each individual, almost cell molecule in this experience of reality is nothing short of profound. There's this other piece in there, though, that Kamadeva, I was going to ask you, but you answered in today's retelling of the parable that there was this mischievous nature about Kamadeva that made him to want to fire Kamadeva to fire the arrow. Now, that's interesting because in some ways it likens desire to mischievousness. There seems to be a correlation in the frequency. And then the exploration of your work leads down the road of Tantra and then some. And Tantra being, from the layperson's perspective at my end, kind of this harnessing of said energies, but then mischievous has this, how do you harness something mischievous? Or am I drawing too many parallels all at once here?
Mm. Well, my reading, and I've revisited this on the occasion a few times, is that perhaps, as often with these very ancient, right, these stories that are these myths that are to point out the fundamental, let's say, laws of nature and bring us that perennial reminder, lays maybe in juxtaposing something here, that the mischievousness of Kamadeva as a god of love, right? That's his job, that's his domain. Same as with the Eros of the Greeks. Perhaps it was that somehow God had this idea that he is the one who is in charge of the ordeal of whom and who is to receive that arrow. He was the one who would, for his playful sport, make that distinction, and Shiva adjusts the situation, right, as the supreme, right, being, where beingness itself emanates from and originates, simply adjusts the situation with the just one single glance that pulverizes the lesser god into the vapor of creation. So in other words, he makes this little tweak there, so that love is not something that there is for you or I or whoever is lucky to experience, but literally, fundamentally, that what is at the very fabric of creation, because that's what it is. So he makes that little kind of like, okay, this is our essence. It's the air we breathe, as I often refer to that, like, it's everywhere. It's an ether. It vibrates. It's what whether we know it or not. So one can reflect on this in many different ways, so that we don't assign love, or rather, we don't create this some kind of subordination, or let alone confine experience of love to these circumstances that somehow maybe one is gifted with. And very often in our culture, and I'm not saying our culture, this is throughout the history, you could see this, right? The points of departure, this like real exemplars and beautiful legendary lovers, right, that exemplify, let's say, what love really is about. Those who forsake everything, for the sake of love. But love is fundamentally is the essence, and that's what this myth, to me personally, points out, so that we kind of also separate wheat from the chaff in terms of these projections that we have, and somehow purify, maybe, separate wheat from the chaff, maybe is fitting here, what love is essentially. Love is very, very much at the very fabric of creation. And so it's something that is there at all times for us to tap into, because it is our essence, it is our nature. So it's not just because in the moment when one's heart is being pierced by that, momentarily, let's say, desire entering there for someone, and then the whole ordeal begins, but rather that we are submerged and live in that. And maybe that's what separates this cultural, continuously recycled consensus of how we assign love to a special place in a relational aspect, where we think, love always has an object, and then when that, let's say, love directed to the object of our love, that's when the love is. To me, it feels, and there are continuous reminders that that's a very, very, very limited understanding. So the myth points out as a reminder that Eros is alive at the base of creation. He just went underground. He has to be there. So it is distributed absolutely equally. We all are there at that level.
Can love and desire be used interchangeably, or are they different?
That's an interesting take on that. Interesting take. Something that, again, would be polemized, and I think there is definitely some use to separate wheat from the chaff here, in terms of like really what we speak of when we speak of desire. Because in spiritual traditions, the attitude towards desire often is seen as a watermark, right? That it often seen as where one can sail and one can sink. It's literally that what gives this possibility for orienting ourselves in a given spiritual tradition, approaches, paths, methodologies, because desire stands there as an unapologetic reminder of why we're here in this form, why we're here in these bodies, and what this body is equipped with. So some traditions, they emphasize continuously on the necessity to curb the desires. And they see this as fundamentally the very point of departure if one wants to really arrive at, let's say, if one's destination, if one's goal is freedom, liberation, then one needs to understand what desire is. So there is this very, very unapologetic approach towards desire as something to be curbed, to understand that desire is here to dissuade us, sway us off the path, that we are filled with desires, that in fact the desires are inseparable from the impulses that are driving us forth constantly. There are these kind of perspectives. And almost as an antithesis to that, there are also perspectives that see desire as something which is not of human origin. In fact, desire is not something that one can say, well, this is my desire, even if the egoic structure of this, let's say, direct experience of being so-and-so gives one sense, what I want this, and I don't want that, I wish and I'd like to, and what have you, and somehow the desire is colored by being personalized. But there is this understanding that all desires spring forth from the very same source where everything else is sprung forth. So separating desire that we experience, let's say, now speaking in plural, because really it can only be spoken of truly to understand in terms of I. Then maybe we can come back to this if we are to speak about it, collective consciousness. But I am experiencing a desire, and that desire has the same origin from where the very desire for manifestation comes forth in the first place. So this is a fundamentally different approach, and of course, it is of course also prone to being hijacked if not properly understood, right, as an invitation to for continuing reveling in a status quo, an invitation for indulging in one's tendencies. But if understood truly for what it is, that one doesn't really desire, there's some other mechanisms at play, that this desire, let's say desire for this or desire for that, belongs to the very, very cosmic outpouring. And this is very important distinction that separates Tantra from many other spiritual traditions, because it understands desire as inseparable from the process of manifestation, and therefore desire to be worked with, not against. Because there is another understanding that one cannot work against desire, because that in most cases can and will reinforce that desire by virtue of driving it deeper and deeper under the layers of the subconscious, where it will, effectively speaking, lay dormant until it will combust when the situation is, let's say, conducive for that. And again, speaking about the tradition, which is so rich in all these analogies, there are these reminders how the greatest sages, forget about sages, avatars were tempted with desires, because the seeds of these desires were already sown in their karmic interactions in their previous incarnations. So even in the classical unfoldment of the Mahavatar stories, let's say how Vishnu comes to restore the Dharma, and to keep the whole thing going, we can see how each of Vishnu's incarnations carry the karmic repercussions of the previous incarnation, of the deeds of that particular avataric form. You see? So these encounters are particularly, at some point, almost like in the plot, is extraordinary when Rama meets Parashurama. In other words, in the same time frame, Rama, as an incarnation of Vishnu, actually meets Parashurama, which is also incarnation of Vishnu, where the job of Parashurama was to kill Kshatriyas, because he came to remind Kshatriyas that they forgot and swayed off the Dharma. And here Rama encountering the previous incarnation. And I think it gave that as to create that time warp in this, let's say, unfoldment of, because no other avatars ever encountered each other. They all had a sequence of unfoldment, right? Like from the fish to the tortoise and so forth to, all of them had in their own place, time. But those two meet together. This is a bizarre part in Ramayana. Almost like to bring that in a more visceral way. So if this happens to avatars, let's say, it's bound to happen to every one of us in a sense, let's say, that we will encounter here a whole load of our desires, because according to this line of thought, the very body, even down to its shape and constitutional setup, is taking the form in such way so that it can be best fit to fulfill the desires and aspirations that at some point were laid in a form of seeds. So the proper understanding of desire here is deeply spiritual. It's not just something like, well, and the counter argument, of course, can be thrown many times, like, oh, what if I desire something which is totally nothing to do with spiritual unfoldment and evolution? If you have that desire, it means it is there at some point, was in a form of a seed, and you are experiencing that now. So effectively speaking, it is for a purpose of evolution, even if that desire is to show you that you are either to relinquish that desire or to go for it. But by curbing the desire, that's the tantric understanding, the repercussions can be fatal sometimes. Fatal in a sense that it will create a possibility for when, at the least expected moment, the desire will manifest itself and create havoc in otherwise where everything seems nice and dandy and like everything is cool and I'm like, filled with peace and serenity and everything, love and what have you. And suddenly my life is completely gone upside down, inside out, because of a single encounter or something. So this is very important distinction and a reminder as well. And just to add, even in those traditions where desires meant to be worked with in the sense of curbing them and extinguishing anything that dissuades one on a spiritual path, there are pockets, internal knowledge of how to work with them. And one such scripture is notorious for that. Patanjali Sutras, largest part, which is known to the scholars as Vibhuti Pada, often translated as extraordinary powers, deals with precisely that, how to develop psychic powers. Why, you would ask? A yogic scripture which set its goal for complete and utter liberation, freedom, right? That total and utter withdrawal from the affairs of the world, because that's what Patanjali Sutra is. It's a Samkhya-based yogic text. It's based on Samkhya, which sees Purusha and Prakriti as two independently functioning aspects, even as tattvas in the classical system of Indian philosophy. Purusha and Prakriti. And in the view of Samkhya, one's goal is to separate the involvement of Prakriti, which is nature in English language, nature, our nature, right? All nature, from that what is exemplified by eternal spirit, which stands aloof to creation. And in that, standing aloof, in that separation, one attains freedom. So all clear here. And the exposition of sutras are unapologetic in a sense. The first two chapters deals with practices, methodologies, and then with all that what could be spoken of as yogic psychology, what goes behind the scenes. It explains the nature of emotion, feeling, thought, how impressions are sown and woven into the fabric of that identity, how to dismantle that. Effectively speaking, it's a surgical precision work on how to work on the spiritual anatomy. And then suddenly comes the Vibhuti-pada, where methodology is given of how to fulfill one's desires. Okay? So it's like, what? You know? So you see that because the desires are understood to be here as an inherent part of what the psyche is. So the Atma, the soul here, is because of desire. So the process of separation, the process of fragmentation is inseparable from the desire. So desire here to be worked at that fundamental level. So yogis are given the access to work at a psychic level, to distinguish what they really want as opposed to what they think they want, because it's not at the level of thinking. The Patanjali Sutras introduced this classical system of fusion known as samyama, of the last three limbs of yoga. That Ashtanga yoga, the 8-limb system of yoga, right? Where like from yamas and yama, all that, asana, pranayama, and so forth, to the last three, which are known as with, like concentration, meditation, and integration, right? In Sanskrit, they're known as, dharana, dhyan, samadhi. Altogether, they're known as fusion, samyama. So this art of samyama is a very yogic way of how to bring thought to stillness, to such degree of transcendence, where samyama can be applied on any chosen subject, on any chosen topic. And the Vibhuti-pada is there to practice that, to foster that. And in fostering that, the possibilities are given for the so-called, now I'm using this parenthesis, all those siddhis, those extraordinary powers. And of course, they are not for the sake of acquiring these powers, because that will become very clear in the fourth and final chapter of the Patanjali Sutras, where the job will be to separate wheat from the chaff in a sense of coming into the state of abiding alone, that coveted state of what the whole, let's say, last pada is entitled, kaivalya, aloneness, abiding alone. So that dynamics of the sutras here show us the anatomy of how we function as beings, human beings. And in that part of the sutras, known as Vibhuti-padas, the extraordinary powers, the methodology is given so as for the person who sets the goal as liberation, will have access to the subtlest level where the thought itself rises, and being able to navigate his or her life from that point where one creates the possibility, where one manifests not from the level of I want this, I want that, because desires are springing forth uninterruptedly, because that's the way of why we're here in the form already. But rather go at the level where one can, as it were, as a skillful, whether technician or surgeon or what have you, whatever analogy we can give, right? Adept, exactly. To work at the level of templates. So one works at the level. This is, I don't want to just go into that language because it's not my domain. I'm just simply want to throw it out there. That's the level of epigenetics. In a modern language, that's the level of epigenetics. In other words, the extraordinary thing about this is whatever experiences take place already to a baby in the womb of the mother, every sensation and feeling and thought that mother experiences contributes to the sensations and feelings of the person who would become an individual grown-up person, and that connection is there intact. The science of epigenetics says to us that why does mother feels what happens to the baby if she is in tune to her world of intuition, and if she doesn't discard this, because it's also possible to discard the intuitive part and be completely living in a mental field, is because of that. Carrying the baby under her heart in the womb creates this, you see? So this, what I call, and why I brought this epigenetics here, is because yogi goes at that level where it can add, adjust, tweak, you see? And there are, classically speaking, extraordinary powers that pose a lot of, let's say, controversy / dismissal / ridicule / fascination, is where, like, how to walk on water, how to fly, levitate, how to become infinitely small, how to become huge, those classical CDs, phenomenal powers, right? It equips the yogi, an adept, with psychic methodology. And if there is something that he or she needs to experience, so as not to thwart the evolution, even if that, let's say, will be from enjoying something at the material plane. Let's take this very attentively here, so as not to be ridiculed or dismissed. Let the yogi go about it not by losing his mind out there in the world, by bringing that into them. In other words, the world come to them. They don't go out into the world to bring that. The world comes to them. I'm giving this deliberate exaggeration. In other words, creating this, pulling the matrix in such way that it simply gathers the forces of nature so as to assist that desire. That's what that aforementioned scripture given as an example, where the purpose of desire is understood, not discarded. And I know it's a long and windy reflection response to what you have brought out into the open to, right, for us to reflect on. But I feel, because it's so intricate here, we don't want to just come up with a kind of like a, I think this is just, I would say, to give us a basic outline of what we deal with. Because desire, when we speak about it, and going back to where you have posited it, is desire and love the same, or is love and desire come together? Well, maybe it will be a bit of a stretch to call desire and love the same, but they are, in a sense, if we speak of love as the essence of who we are, as the essence of who we are, in a sense of how, let's say, other terms used for that essence of who we are in terms of awareness and being, like, let's say, peace, right? Consciousness, bliss, and so forth, beauty. Then desire here belongs to the very, very same essence. And desire is an impulse, that creative impulse of creative intelligence to know itself. So in other words, the desire, it's the arrow that is always shot as a boomerang to come back and slay the target, in a sense of experiencing itself for what it is. But the desire here is not something that is taking us outside externally, even though it appears to be so in most cases, let's say, when we speak about it at the point of view of individual expanding himself, herself, out there in the world of pursuing the desires. That is correct, because at that level of conversation and applying this understanding, this would be a correct notion. That would be a correct way of saying that. But what happens underneath or beneath it all is that desire itself here is a self-interacting dynamic within consciousness. So this rehabilitates desire without the need to work with desire at the subtlest level, so as to understand why we have desires in the first place. So in other words, it's another invitation. Before we pursue desires relentlessly as we do, we need to understand what's the driving force and where is it driving us in the first place.
Thank you so much, because it's the way you've described it illuminates it to be primordial. You mentioned the relentless nature of it a couple of stanzas ago. I couldn't help but smile when you said, there's this point where even when we do this repression thing, there's this combustion thing that happens, dare we say. And just because we're in quite deep, just to bring some levity to it, I was reflecting on one of your interviews I watched. People were asking, there was a gentleman asking about the sacredness of sexuality. And he was talking about how India as a subcontinent, he's spoken to teachers there, and yet India and sexuality is quite repressed. And I remember pausing the interview, or pausing the question at that point and going, is it really? It's the largest population in the world. So it was just that I just couldn't help but reflect on that. Pardon me for bringing the levity in at that point. You mentioned the relentlessness of desire, and I think this is quite profound, because there was a certain maturation that availed itself to me when I started to realize almost the infinite nature of desire. It's and maybe you can correct me, and it is infinite, to this very 3D understanding that growing up as a young man, you're balancing family, you're balancing work, you're balancing commitments, and all of a sudden it comes into this point where I recognize I can, touch wood, actually have anything. Very fortunate, grown in the West, really great environment, I'm discussing epigenetics. But I can't have everything. And this was a real meditative, contemplative piece for myself that really I feel matured me, because up until that point, my desire was immature. It was just this consistent scanning. This will do, that'll do. This is great. This is fantastic. Until there was this, I feel like I really matured contemplating this concept of what is it that you're really going to set out to desire? Because it is potentially, and it wasn't foreign for me at that time to even contemplate desiring desirelessness as the ultimate desire, getting hella koan on myself, kind of, trying to get into that space. Part of me, when you were mentioning the Patanjali Sutras before and recognizing, like, there's a level beyond where, we're back to aloneness, wonders if the wave-like nature, everything just collapses back into its particulate nature in some ways. If the desire, primordial desire, was purely just for aloneness, would any of this even exist? But the question that emerges for me is really around this relentless nature of desire and its perceiving infiniteness as it emerges within our experience of this I at times, and the refinement of the adept in terms of what to say yes to, what to say no to when it can feel so overwhelming.
Well, the easiest way for me would be to simply lean on, or in other words, like there's no need to reinvent the wheel kind of thing. It's like this has been dealt so beautifully in Indian subcontinent as a civilizational setup, giving it, legitimizing, let's say, all that what we so far have been speaking about. And it's known as this Purushartha, and it's the 4 pillars of life, which is made of, in Sanskrit, they're known as Kama, Artha, Dharma, Moksha, which translated means enjoyment, wealth or richness, duty, and liberation. So the 4 pillars of life, and they are legitimate. It's not like, oh, that pillar sounds more important, like let's say Dharma. And there have been attempts at making it as more important. And if you look into the analysis of this, and it's plenty out there to see how some perspective traditions, let's say paths, they are veered towards understanding that the first 2, Kama and Artha, which represent enjoyment, right? That very, very Kama, pleasure, desire, and richness, in other words, means. It's not pointless to want to enjoy something if one doesn't have means. You see, this is immediately interconnected. So we will build on that now in a moment. So the emphasis would be like, well, these 2 just to lead to Dharma. And yes, one can understand why that is done in some religious, spiritual, let's say, perspectives. This one would feel that that is justified. But when it comes to this civilizational understanding, it shows the legitimacy of how all 4 are interconnected at the evolutionary level. So the Kama is a natural, very, very legitimate way of why we are wired to experience pleasure. This is known. Again, I'm going into the territory of neuroscience. The neuroscientist you spoke to and interviewed, they all spoke about it in one voice. We are wired, literally, to experience joy and pleasure. This is what we are at the biological level. So this Kama here is very, very clear. Artha, as the pillar, which stands for means, right? It also incorporates, it's a very complex term, in fact. It's not richness just in terms of, like, let's say, cash, although it includes that without a doubt. It's the means with which one can enjoy. In other words, it's a level of refinement. It's the level of possibility of one to enjoy truly, enjoy fully. So that's a true definition of affluence. It encompasses in itself all aspects, which of course one must have a healthy body to enjoy to begin with. Otherwise, like what the enjoyment is, right? One would have to have, let's say, certain absolutely undeniable ways of from hygiene to aesthetics, right? All that contributes to that sense of life well lived, lived fully. Then comes dharma, right? That duty. So one understands that here this is, serves as a pillar of society. It's a civilizational setup here, that one is always carries a duty, whatever duty that is there. At a certain point, it's a duty of a parent, right? The duty of the servant, civil servant, duty serving the society. Like there are these, let's say, some fundamental duties that we perform. And of course, at some point, this duty is reaches the point where that duty is to why one lives this life in the first place, which brings the fourth pillar, moksha, the liberation. So in other words, a full understanding of what is it all about, really. So all together seen as pillars, which means they all support the overall, whatever that is, structure, construct. So in other words, you can't remove one pillar so that everything is then holds itself on just dharma. Or you just emphasis on moksha or bust. You see, all together comprises of what is considered to be in Indian civilization for quite some times passed on uninterruptedly as legitimate goals of life. And pursuing these goals is not considered to be swaying off the path. So even pursuing, let's say, life worth living at the level when one feels that there is this fulfillment of the quality of artha, right? That what exemplifies here that very important, because they, of course, they go in pairs here, right? There's no artha without, there's no karma without artha, right? There's no way to enjoy unless there are means to achieve these enjoyments, right? Likewise, dharma and moksha are linked as well, interconnected. So why am I bringing this? And why I said it's like there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So when it comes to this legitimacy, this is very, very clearly displayed here. Then, you know, people thought about it, reflected on this, you know, and they came up with this. Like that's what would comprise the healthy society, the healthy outline of society. So it will make people who would be in pursuit of a certain, let's say, driven by certain aspirations. And it's not like we would have to hold accountable that like someone for whom this aspect prevails perhaps in a certain point in life, because then the life is also seen very clearly in its trajectorial unfoldment, following these aspects. There's another also beautiful concept in Indian civilization as the phases, right? There's a phase of student, right? The brahmacharya, right? A student of consciousness. In other words, we learn, that's what it is. We learn, acquire through experiences, learning. Then the phase of grihastha, the householder. We are here to express ourselves as the need to be with someone, create family, children. That's very legitimate, supported cultural setup. Then naturally we outgrow that phase, we fulfill that duty, we go into the phase where we are prone to be then driven and motivated by other forces within. And then we come to that what is then spoken of as, let's say, renunciate, sannyasin. So the phases of life of every human being is seen like that. In Indian tradition, there is this beautiful, for example, time when, classically speaking, when women would be released at a certain age from these duties because she enters into that phase where she needs to find herself. She needs to find herself. She has given herself into motherhood, right? And in, let's say, civilizational setup where it's not just a single child, when it will be at least 3 children, right? 3 to 4 to 5 children. That's a chunk of life. That's life given to upbringing the family. And then woman is released into her own very sacred space where she has to find herself. Today, in the West, it's spoken of like this, all this menopause and the woman, the hormonal imbalances and how to deal with that. There's, thankfully, Ayurveda points out back to the harmonious setup what this is. Woman craves more than anything to find back her own self. Whatever that means, of course, it may be in trial and error, reintegrate, right? But more, let's say, those who are more attuned to the inner desires will soon realize that this is the phase to find truly who I am in my skin. Likewise, for a man as well, right? That phase where even speaking in terms of like cultural setup supported by the tribe, where a man of a certain age would want to walk out of the house, literally in pursuit of, let's say, God realization. I'm using these blanket terms. It would be understood as a legitimate way of life, supported by thousands of years of ways of life. So, of course, it doesn't have to be in a dramatic way, but overall, what we can see here is that how different desires express themselves differently. And if we look at, let's say, the world at large, it's like it's filled with desires of unimaginable magnitude, how each and everyone wants to express themselves, right? Someone wants something at each given moment in time. Sometimes it's just to have enough on the table, right? That's the legitimate desire. Sometimes just enough to cover the roof, right? That's a legitimate desire. And it goes. And there seems to be sky's the limit. Literally, sky's the limit. For some people is to leave this planet and go live on the other planet is the ideas that they are driven by, right? Like, because that seems to be the translation of their, let's say, trajectory, in my perspective, gone berserk, right? Slightly, instead of creating that enclosure in a sense of falling back onto itself, not knowing how to do that, not knowing how to find that beautiful way where the waves returns back, where one needs to find the repose within, where would one go if you have all the riches in the world? Well, of course, you will be like these guys like Elon Musk. You would want to go to Mars. You would want to create something no one done before. So the one's legacy is then in that. Also, these are desires, right? Desires. We can, of course, redress this and why some desires are aligned with the evolution. And some desires simply seem to go or seem to be have propensity of their own, just spinning out of its own unstoppable, whatever that force.
Like a whirlpool. Yeah.
Exactly, like a whirlpool, that in Christianity, dragonfly, like that kind of like where it's considered to be the whirlpools of negative energy, because it does not revolve around the axis of creation, but it creates the opposite direction or attempts to create the opposite direction. So that This is a different discussion altogether. But sometimes it's helpful to behold this, let's say, with an eagle eye, that overview, how all of us desire something. And it's unimaginable in terms of its expression. Unimaginable. And of course, there are patterns in that. We can see there is in that overall ocean of this, let's say, everyone desires something. We could maybe see that there are some currents, undercurrents and currents, certain desires, like certain members of society, they are gravitating towards this kind of desires, you see. Others are gravitating towards this kind of desires. But all desires ultimately are ways of self-expression. The self expresses itself. So from this minute point of view, from this vantage point, from the vantage point of an individual, it seems like you or I desire something. But we forget that we might belong to a current, right? Larger current. Something is at play, and we're simply channeled, taken in, because of whatever circumstances, alignment we have reached to that point, the frequencies with which we are, let's say, humming at a given moment in time, brings us to a certain current, and it somehow becomes more dominant in our life. At least this is my understanding of how we seem to be drawn to certain aspects more than others, right? Like some people will be obsessing about, right, the latest Ferrari. Some will be just obsessing about it on the level of, well, just witnessing it. Others owning it, right? So yeah, it's legitimate. The Ferrari exists in consciousness. It doesn't just exist in Monte Carlo's car race, right? In Grand Prix. No, it obviously is there. In consciousness, there is enough magnanimity to have, saints, Dalai Lamas, right? Thich Nhat Khans, right? Martin Luther Kings, and Ferraris. In consciousness, there is place for Hitlers and Mao Zedongs and Stalins and what have you, not Genghis Khans, and this all have to be at some point reflected by us. How all this can happen in consciousness. All these very legitimate, healthy topics to reflect on, to take us outside of, let's say, this immediacy of likes and dislikes and righteousness or lack of thereof.
Igor, we've gone from the myth of love and desire becoming vapor, being a primordial force in all things, to the individual and how best to weave their life with this understanding. Very comprehensive picture. Thank you. There will be some people looking to understand, because there's Tantra as a word. Where does this live in this tapestry?
Well, the example of Patanjali Sutras was given specifically to include and juxtapose that at the same time, how even in the traditions where Patanjali Sutras belong to, which is a yogic tradition, which has this unapologetic attitude towards, let's say, practice of exemplified in control of the senses, withdrawal of the senses, right? That pratyahara, being, effectively speaking, fostering discipline. And this can be seen throughout so many spiritual traditions, East, West, doesn't matter. You can see that discipline approach is absolutely a must. Tantra here stands as unique in a sense that it understands the inseparable nature of desire from who we are in this embodied form. And it understands that, as what I've mentioned earlier, even the physical shape, the constitutional setup of how we come into this world, it's like the instrumentality best suited to fulfillment of what is sown in the first place in forms of psychic impressions that are carried through the subtler bodies when the physical body perishes. All this is accumulated in a psychic field. I'm now deliberately not using yogic terminology so as to, for every listener to relate to this. So that psychic field, that psychic resonance, literally in the form, and then maybe if people want to understand this, and that's why I brought the epigenetics here, that it's something constantly in motion, right? That something is constantly in the way of influencing and being influenced. Because DNA is not a molecule. DNA is what gives rise to the molecule. DNA is a frequency, it's a vibration. DNA is a field. So DNA is a velocity, is a frequency of vibration. And the strands and the way the DNA vibrates, it gives rise to the RNA when, effectively speaking, sound collapses into a form, sound collapses into something particular. So that's where the first molecule is being formed. But DNA itself is not a molecule. It's a frequency, it's a sound. And it's absolutely agreed. I don't know why it is somehow automatically being referred to as a molecule. It's not. It's a vibration. RNA is a molecule. That's where the protein begins to be formed. So this, in other words, our DNA that's what predispositions and sets everything in motion at that very, very subtle level. So the science of epigenetics is fascinating because for the first time, through the scientific lenses of investigation, we have this access to the understanding that everything is constantly in the process. So nothing is set in stone. And that's what makes it so extraordinary, both in terms of the possibility, in terms of the repercussions of what that is. In the previous, let's say, paradigm, we could have kind of like said on, well, that's how it is because the laws of nature are irreducible. So therefore, we live in a certain universe which operates with these wheels, that Newtonian universe of certainty. Whereas, in fact, we live in the world of complete and utter uncertainty. The uncertainty is the very language of nature. And the very principle of uncertainty is what creates infinitude of possibilities and variables. Of course, how and when a certain aspect will be a given chance for it to be actualized, that's a fascinating topic. What is behind the scenes of why, let's say, certain vibrations, frequencies will take prevalence over others that will translate into the way we think, feel, act, and therefore weave our reality out of that. So Tantra is very much that understanding. Tantra operates with this understanding. And, as a very terminology, Tantra is a constant tuning. Ta and Tra is that which is constantly stretched as a string. See, useful here analogy could be used. For the string to hit the desired note, for it to have the desired frequency of resonance, it needs to be stretched. It's no point to have a flabby string, it will not produce nothing. So Tantra is literally that. It's the very, by very definition, is that which is stretching consciousness. It allows the possibility for individualized consciousness to be tuned to the pitch and sound of universal vibrations. So individual here literally as a string can be tuned to hit the note where one begins to vibrate with the frequencies fine enough where it coincides with that what otherwise could be spoken of as the music of the spheres. That cosmic resonance, where we no longer feel we live somehow as isolated individuals, but we simply vibrate and vibe as that cosmos, as that interaction of this primordial sound with the rest of creation. And when that taking place, it doesn't even matter how we name it. It doesn't matter whether we can create theories or we can even be articulate about it. Some of us will be, others will not be. It's beside the point. That's the beauty of Tantra, right? So it's not like everyone has to have PhD or doctorate. No, you can just like really go about your daily life, whatever you do, whether you are like working with a collider, or just cutting wood and like quietly working as a carpenter. That's absolutely irrelevant what the mental activity is. So that's what Tantra, effectively speaking, is. And Tantra works with absolutely everything. It's all-embracing path. It's known as being that, all-embracing. So sometimes I give this analogy that if we push this, let's say, if push come to shove, if we are to like, okay, all right, so what's these approaches are? And then we can speak about it as spitting it out or swallowing it in. So the Advaitic, Vedantic perspective, the perspective of negation, the perspective of, let's say, illusion, appearance, is spitting it out, spitting creation out. In other words, not allowing this. And it's a lofty, very, very profound way of how also this can lead to absolute freedom. And Tantra is the opposite of that. It's galloping it down. It's swallowing it up. So that's what it is. It's all embracing. So it's not this aspect I will accept, but this one somehow I have a problem with. I will take this, but I will leave that. No, it has to be honest. If in one approach there's this spitting out, not letting it stuck in the throat, in another one it's taking it in fully. You see, that's the Shiva's approach. He takes the whole, he drinks it all. Like maybe we've started with one of the Puranic myths that you suggested, and here's another one. So at the moment of creation, when the beings of light and beings of darkness, like devas and asuras, were churning the ocean of creation to extract the nectar of immortality, Amritam, right? They held giant serpent Sesha, at the head and at the tail, respectively, churning it, right? This coincided with also poison rising to the surface as well, you see? So not just Amritam, but all that muck, poison raised to the top. Seeing that this could be mixed with the rest of creation, Shiva takes that and drinks that poison. He drinks that poison and the poison stays in his throat. And that's why he's called Nilakanta, blue-throated Shiva. See? So he filters the creation from the poison. He basically keeps the poison at the level of the throat. There are, of course, deep metaphysical correlation here. But the myth here exemplifies that the magnanimity of the creator here, right, that Shiva represents in the story, is to make sure that poison is not spread out and mixed into the creative order. So he holds it neatly here, and of course there are some psychological, emotional repercussions of how Parvati comes to, to assist Shiva, because she sees, it causes her beloved supreme God tremendous discomfort to hold that poison there. But just leaving aside that sentiment, this what it could represent. You see, that throwing this here as an analogy, since we've started with the, let's say, the mythological, let's say, allusions and how they correlate to. So we could see that also here playing itself in that same way, how in the creational order, how everything is held in the way, you see? So, and that's also just maybe extend this analogy where creation here is seen, everything down there is that elemental order, right? All the elements will proceed from the throat chakra down, right? All the elements, right? All the elements, all the 5 Mahabhutas elements, which comprises the entire manifested universe. So, and it's being held as, well, preventing from that poison to go down. And in terms of yogic anatomy, this is also understood to be in reverse, you see? So in other words, our existence, our universe is constantly in danger of being subjected to some poison, some toxins, you see? So therefore our consciousness need to be raised so as to be at the top of elemental order. So it has to be reached at least at that level where the poison does not proceed down. And we talked about Kundalini in our first and previous conversation a lot. And one of the mythological connotations of Kundalini, often traditionally spoken of, in a sense that it exemplifies this state of consciousness in homeostatic repose, in a state of slumber. And that state of slumber, that cosmic power exemplified by the serpent releases poison, intoxication, and it is self-intoxicated, you see, in a state of a sleep, in a state of that slumber. And that self-intoxication is the result of, let's say, why life is lived by individual ignorant status, because consciousness is in that condition. So the awakening here is seen, you see, as both coming out of that state of slumber, when one awakens from the self-intoxicated, self-imposed state of homeostasis. So this is why the perennial, let's say, analogies in terms of that pyramid of spiritual experiences, the higher is the level of awakening, the less differences there are across the cultural board, across the gender. At the bottom of that pyramid, we all have very, very different experiences. But when it comes to, let's say, pinnacle of these experiences, it's almost as if every mystic of every tradition begins to agree with each other. Right? So like the differences are transcended, the differences are, they become irrelevant. Not sure how this all kind of like, if this was too meandering, but.
No. Very, very helpful. Very helpful. here we arrive at this juncture to, I'm almost nervous bringing in the word. You've mentioned the word manifest a few times. It's a word that's laden with a lot of, I don't want to sound like this new age baggage is probably the easiest way to say it. But there's, I try not to say it that way, because I have a lot of respect for the laws of resonance. You mentioned Tantra and us tuning ourselves as a string, attraction and repulsion is, I'm sure downwind from there. But recently you've been furthering your fascinations or your offerings even into bringing bodies of work together. Where, I think you mentioned there's the opportunity to let go with laser light precision, and my fascination just lit up like a Christmas tree. So, can we start to understand a little bit around your worldview from these depths that we've traversed into what could potentially be treacherous in terms of manifestation, how to really honor that from what you espouse?
It's interesting to observe that the, let's say, topic of how to manifest this or that, how to manifest per se, increasingly taking the internet and the attention of, let's say, those who are aligned towards fulfillment of their aspirations by storm. Like I've witnessed that it maybe somehow wasn't as apparent, but in the last few years, the trading topic of manifestation is one of the top ones in terms of the offerings out there. And not just ever saw that documentary entitled The Secret. Remember that?
Very much so.
So which in my understanding, and this has been spoken a lot about, of course it was fascinating and maybe even eye-opening for a lot of us at the time. Was just half the story, and in certain cases misleading. I know that those who have taken part in that documentary, those who were interviewed, were deeply dissatisfied because they felt that they were manipulated. The way, let's say, the editing took place, the way what their contribution was edited in such a way as to, effectively speaking, help building a certain narrative of what The Secret as a documentary meant. And the reason why I'm choosing this, to speak about this with that particular documentary, is because a lot of people have somehow gotten an understanding that if one can imagine and keep reimagining how one wants to live life or what one wants in the domain of physical manifestation, then that would bring the results. Like that whole, let's say, notion of creating a board, like that, on the fridge, right? All these examples of people who were, like in the world of material creation, a perfect relationship, a villa, right? All this, like, let's say, the epitome of life well lived, how it is understood in a given culture, in a given cultural, let's say, setup, as that manifestation of the dream life, right? Swimming pool, cool vehicle to drive, right? Like, and I'm just not going to even add, just like everyone can feel the fill the gaps here,
It
fill
is.
the
It is
dots.
an unending list after all.
Yeah. So, and all that pinned faithfully to the board, placed somewhere where one can see it every single day, and that's what will bring manifestation. That's what will manifest, and that's how the desires are manifest. And this is a great delusion and misleading. Obviously, by now, I don't know how many years ago The Secret was. Time flies. I think it could be 20 years now, if I'm not mistaken, or so. So in other words, it's a generational gap now. And there are other perspectives, of course, have been expounded on, where more interesting approaches have been taken. And of course, there have always been an approach that one need to understand that everything comes from a place of thought. It comes from a place where the thinking itself is the very, very driving force of what brings something into manifestation. At the same time, before I will build on that, I want to bring the reminder, which I also spoke about back even then, that we forget the very important aspects here exemplified by the laws of cause and effect. And these laws of cause and effect, the aka karma, is of tremendous importance here. For example, I gave it as whenever I want to kind of impress someone with effort versus, let's say, lack of thereof. Someone like, let's say, aforementioned Elon Musk, or anyone who is known to be there as the wealthiest people on the planet, even if they don't do anything, absolutely, like just decide, I'm not going to do anything, the wealth in terms of the equity will flow into them. And that is by virtue of just having the planets in certain positions at birth. It's very well known to astrologers. There are some combinations of planets known as yogas. Yogas, the planets usually takes 3 planets, sometimes 2 planets, depending in what houses could form a particular yogas. And these yogas, some of these yogas herald and signify some extraordinary level of achievement. And some of this extraordinary level of achievement includes tremendous wealth, accumulation of wealth. So it's not even, oh, this person was so clever in this, that, or in doing this or that. By virtue of just having this in their birth chart, they will acquire wealth by hook or by crook. In this case, I'm not going to be scrupulous enough to say literally by hook or by crook. It doesn't matter whether their pursuit will be righteous or unrighteous in terms of ethics, whether they exerted tremendous effort or they just did it from the rocking chair. It is irrelevant. You see, whether this is hitting a jackpot and, being born in the right time, in the right setting, being in the right place at the right time, all this what is contributing to that astronomical wealth. Yes, of course, there are plenty of examples when the wealth and the riches are built in terms of generational setup, generation after generation. That's another thing here. Now, what seems to be acted as, forgive me, a kind of poison into a lot of even spiritual communities, evolutionary oriented folk among us, is that because of the lack of living, experiencing the sense of lack, and wanting to live life at a level where it is completely justifiable, let's say, let me just give more drastic examples so that we can kind of the audience also correlates to that. What about a single mother who is bringing 2 kids on her own? Let's say relationship, marriage did not work out. She's all aligned towards spiritual, goals, working on herself, yoga teacher, what have you, right? Therapist, struggling to make ends meet. Of course, like having these tools of how to manifest, how to make one's life better, is a legitimate way, because it also could be justified here, there and then, that it's already someone who is living in alignment with the values, with their values, you see? When someone wants to learn how to manifest because they work on a stock market or they're estate agents and they really cut through, sort of like aggressive approach towards generating wealth, that's another story. We are not here to pass a judgment. Every one of us are legitimately here pursuing that same very, very modus, under the spell of expressing that, what we spoke earlier, as these desires, right? This what we all, the air we breathe, right? This dispersed in the vapor of creation. Eros imbues everything, right? That desire is literally is what makes us tick, what makes us wake up in the morning, and a driving force of a lot of our activities and actions. So where do we draw the line? Whose desire is more holy, or who desires more just, right? This is a crazy biscuit, right? Will be like, at what point do we give like the leeway to, okay,
I'm listening.
Yeah. Okay, we'll include that. Okay, well, you qualify, man, come in. So you see, this is virtually impossible. So therefore, again, we are left here with the universal principles at work, universal, let's say, what is beneath it all. So why I said this, that a certain poison has been injected, and a lot of people out there profess to have the exact methodologies of how to manifest. And I came across a lot of sponsored material where, like, you're doing it wrong. The reason why you're not manifesting is because manifesting doesn't come from meditation, doesn't come from visualization, doesn't come from intention placing and all the rest of it. And of course, the cliffhanger, you have to take this course of how to manifest, Well, frankly, let's just, again, give that eagle eye view for ourselves. And I may surprise some listeners, yourself maybe including. Why am I taking that stab now, before we go back to the internal mechanics? It's hardly surprising, because we live in our globalized world, right, of currently dominating Western values, which are accepted as the values that are at the very, very driving forces of the, let's say, civilizational alignment currently, when tremendous realignment of the classes taking place, in a sense that the middle class in the countries where it was the strongest collapsed. You see, we have witnessed gradual deterioration of the middle classes in the civilized so-called Western world. And that is in United States, Great Britain, and rest of Europe. We have seen this breakdown and gradual collapse of the middle class, which formed the backbone of society. In the middle class of the United States and aforementioned countries, let's say just 50 years ago, 50 to 60 years ago, let's say that going back to the generation of the counter movement, right? Counterculture movement of the 60s and the 70s. There was a lot more of financial freedom among young people. It may sound surprising to a lot of people in the audience now, but it is a fact. People were much more willing to take risks, much more willing to go along with what they like to do. I mean, just the mere fact that people have, in their early 20s, on a click of a finger, would go and check themselves into the Indian ashrams, go into the newly opened spiritual movements from China, from Japan, from the Orient in general. People were experimenting with a lot of methodologies, technologies of consciousness. People were not really worrying about their pension and how they're going to meet ends, because the middle class was so strong that they could always lean back on a system where now people cannot afford this. Yes, the generation of yuppies came in the 80s, and that kind of race, the rat race, kicked in, where people were like, hang on a second, I want to make my cut whilst the sun is shining. I want to make it, like I don't want to just be left behind all this hippie culture. I've done this. I want to have something. I want to have a house. I want to have decent income and what have you. This is all very important because we now reach the point collectively where a lot of people, effectively speaking, those who only like I'm saying about social class as people, have been comfortable enough to throw themselves into a lot of, let's say, what would today be a subject of a lot of evaluation. People used to go to India for a few months trip. I am running programs, and I can tell you, man, that for people to carve out 1 week for a retreat, let alone 10 days, is a considerable investment in terms of time. And
not in money, in time.
Yeah, exactly. So you see how different is the setup. So therefore, it's hardly surprising that manifesting is such a trading topic. People literally, it's almost like a barometer, you see? In other words, overall, with the rise of mega millionaires, billionaires, with the rise of also all that wealth that is now being thrown into, like, just go into the Instagram and see how much you can look into in just like a brief scroll, what properties you can own, what luxurious destinations you can live, right? Like you can have a house in Bali and, like you can have house in Florida, you can there's like flat in London, in New York, in Beijing. Like the possibilities out there today are looming in our face and making us all feel poor, even in our conditions where it is far from poor, but somehow always in comparison, it makes us feel inadequate. This is why I gave also the example of single mother raising 2 kids, yoga teacher with her alignment. She's struggling to pay bills, the studio, like schools, this and that. What do you do? So I just wanted to give the climate, the perspective where these classes and workshops on how to manifest and why this is so in vogue. Because we are in the economical climate where for a long time, and now with the pandemic followed by global wars that are being fought, even if they're proxy wars, right, in Ukraine, it's a global war. It's the war between the ideologies of, let's say, the redistribution of powers, rising of the new superpowers, and all this is accompanied by collapse. In Europe, we witnessed the collapse of complete and utter faith in the governments, what's happening in France, Germany, England. All these contributing factors to people don't know what to rely on. Whereas just 60 years ago, There was a very strong consensus that one can just go to India and always come back. You see, there will always be a house to come back to. There will always be some kind of governmental support to come back to bounce back to what one wants to do. So this gives us the overview and then explains why, with the rise of self-employment, people's businesses online, all this contributed to the rise of this kind of a category of offerings there that is meant to help army of people out there to sort out their economic struggles. But a lot of that, unfortunately, I have to just tell this and call spade a spade, is nothing other than just another business. A lot of these people simply sell what they effectively came up with as a commodity geared towards those who feel they are desperately in need to restore the cash flow. Just let us put it as bluntly as it is. Because when it comes to manifesting, most people, 99%, want to simply live a decent life, Amrit, not because they want to fly to the moon and back. Okay? So there are no workshops to manifest how to desire a desireless state and merge in Brahman. No workshops needed for that, right? So this is a different story. So we know it is tailored for those who are in need of sorting out what they feel is somehow is in jeopardy. So if we make this as an overview, if we somehow not shy away from redressing this, then I would be ready to speak about what is actually going on in terms of the mechanics behind manifesting as we speak of this. Because manifesting does not take place from the picture we pin on the fridge. It does not come from a place of having a clear idea of the type of the house, type of the partner, and all that. All this, in fact, is only in the domain of thought, and thought only. And we don't manifest from the level of the mind. So this is very important adjustment that needs to be made. The question then rises, where do we manifest from?
Please.
So this is why I felt compelled to mention the Patanjali Sutras, because in the Vibhuti-padas, the Yoga Sutras speaks to the very, very underlying principles of where the thought itself springs forth and gains its power. So in other words, the Vibhuti-padas were created to help those who are spiritually motivated, spiritually and nothing else, because the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a spiritual manual. It's not a manual how to become a successful manager. Let's make it very clear. Or CEO of the company. It is geared for those dedicated, committed folk who set themselves free. But the understanding that the underlying nature of desires will continue feeding that psychic content, Yogi is given a methodology of how to go to the source of the thought itself at the nuclear level of the formation of the thought, so as to release that energy that is available there, which in essence create the possibility for psychic flare, or why it is called in the first place a Vibhuti-pada. In other words, why it is translated as extraordinary powers, because there are extraordinary powers.
Is it connected? Sorry for interrupting. Is it connected to that creative impulse you mentioned earlier as well? Sorry for the interruption.
Well, no, absolutely. I'm waiting for your interruptions because I want you to like literally inject and insert this so that because I can speak about this, but it's very important that that you speak on behalf of also your audience. So this impulses of creative intelligence, right? Whether we call them these shaktis or whether simply call them these impulses of energy, which is
The
at the
source of the
very
thought.
yes, they are at the source of everything. Likewise, of course, they are at the source of all thinking, at the source of all feelings. So if we are to speak of manifesting, the first step here is to reach the level where we understand why do we desire something that we desire. So you see, it's almost as if putting the cart before the horses if we don't know why we desire this or that. In other words, desiring something, which then, okay, how do I go about it, is already the wrong way around. And from the yogic perspective, first see the desire for what it is. And in the, let's say, giving it to the English, so we don't like, so making it as succinct and as direct and as possible. The access that these extraordinary powers give in the aforementioned scripture is so that the object of our desire shines forth in its essence. Because prior to that and before that, object appears only as an object. In other words, this object, whatever that object is already a concealed reality. Whether this is a cup in my hand, held by kintsugi, whether this is a teapot where the tea is brewed, house I sit in, desire to become powerful, desire to become lovable, desire to have life that I want to live, it's all in a sphere of objective experience. All these are objects to one and the only subject that is my consciousness. So, therefore, and to reinstate this, objects already conceal, by virtue of their objectivity, the essence that they represent. And therefore, vibhuti-pada, therefore, access needs to be given so that the object shines forth in its essence. When that appears to the yogi, he can then decide if I want to go after that object or not. And if he decides to do that, nothing can stop that yogi, that adept, to achieve his objective. Do you see what we are?
Yeah, you're peering behind the veil. Absolutely. It's the material, and you peer behind the veil, connect to the essence, and then make a determination as at that point.
Yes, but what's important is that every object of our desire already conceals, by the virtue of it being an object. We're going back to
something
fundamental,
profound that is already programmed into your innate desire, and it's communicating. It's a mirror. It's a reflection for you to see.
Yes, it's that dynamic tension between subject and object, and the whole world of forms and appearances is this world of objective experience. At the material level, literally objects. At the mental level, it's thoughts, right? Perceptions. All these are still nothing but objects, but we don't know their essence because that is already an act of concealment. That's how Shiva, awareness, hides itself in the objective sphere of creation. But the reason why we recognize, why I know this is a cup and you know this is a cup, right? Fundamentally, philosophically speaking, because you see yourself in that cup. The self recognizes itself. There's no cup out there. See? The cup is recognized, perceived in yourself. And that is where the subject simultaneously hides itself in the objective sphere of experience, whatever that object happens to be, and reveal itself from the behind the scenes. This is the highest Tantra. But when we come now, let's say, with this understanding to what happens and why, in the Patanjali Sutras, the importance of the Vibhuti Pada, which has been polemized to this day, is to give yogi access through a methodological approach so that object can shine forth in its essence. You see? So in other words, the object no longer conceals the self, conceals the subject, but by virtue of being able to create this through what is known also as perfect discipline, in inverted commas, perfect discipline is the aforementioned samyama, togetherness of dharana, dhyan, samadhi, concentration, meditation, integration. Concentration, meditation, integration, when they're fused together, forms samyama, togetherness. They're together. And that gives access to anything that one then brings forth into one's attention from a completely different level. You see? Everything else is simply subject of thoughts. And what thoughts are? Thoughts are the continuum of thinking. Thoughts are just that. It's like it's regurgitating the same stuff. So when people apply positive thinking, imagination, this and that to manifest, it's, unfortunately, it's a wishful thinking. That's what the English term for that. See? Wishful thinking is has a very, very specific connotations.
Igor, the conscious of the time we have, but I have to ask, this seeing the essence of the object, my own desire being mirrored back as a reflection of my deep primordial self, there's going to be someone tuning in a tough place in their life somewhere, having manifested something that they don't feel entirely comfortable, having manifested, whether that's dis-ease or, heartbreak or something to that effect. What do you say to how that's emerged for that individual?
Well, if you're touching this now in relation to how everything functions, then of course we can't create here the division and separate manifesting in terms of what we want versus manifesting what we think we don't want but unconsciously are attracted to anyway. In other words, this also has to be true in terms of everything. So this is also a nuclear energy we work with at the subtlest level. You see, in terms of both spirituality and a more progressive understanding of psychology, hopefully transpersonal psychology, if we are to speak of psychology, it's actually very small amount what, in terms of the percentage of what contributes to how we live our life, that is perceivable on a conscious level. the unseen part, subconscious, which is available in dreams, and the unconscious part, which is not available because there's no access, it's the domain of deep sleep, is what informs us to the large degree, or larger degree. So therefore we fool ourselves, kidding ourselves, thinking that we kind of go through our life knowing very well what we want. And that's where the question comes in. The true spirituality, in a way, couldn't be said to unfold from the place when we actually have access to that, what otherwise is constantly hidden. So if we only have access to the conscious, which corresponds to the waking state, and we are not per se mastered the art of meditation, and we don't have this access to the integrated states represented by the aforementioned, let's say, samadhi, then we are thinking that we are walking in a broad daylight, but in fact we're constantly stumbling, and sometimes, along the way we have a bumpy ride, or like hit ourselves in that blind spot. That's a perfect example of not living fully consciously. So therefore, yes, we manifest everything, absolutely constantly manifest everything. In other words, someone who says, I want to be famous singer, or famous writer, or famous actor, but at the same time, deep down, being afraid of what that is accompanied by, then there is this immediate contradiction. There's a field of dissonance into what one maybe professes to, what one wants. But one is not fully aware of that because it's unconscious or subconscious, right? Fear of losing anonymity, losing a more intimate way of life, and becoming more public. I'm just giving this as a very, very direct example, how this, on one hand, I want to be this and that, and on the other hand, there is this counter wave, and that counter wave simply cancels that, you see? So this is also a very, very good reminder and example how we can bring into our life a lot of what we don't want, because a lot of that comes from that unconscious and subconscious level. How we harm ourselves at that level, which is, effectively speaking, is invisible to us. Inaccessible, maybe.
At the time it comes for each of us will go. Something happens for each individual. At this moment in the conversation, I'm inclined to sort of zoom out all the way and say potentially that is a deeper desire. Shiv Shakti, make space for the new, your time here. But it seems weird to consider that it's weird to consider the final frontier in this particular incarnation as death and correlating it with desire. And yet in this conversation, it seems to have a place.
I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. You see? And maybe it's also that there is this, hopefully, conscious understanding that something not meant to be known to such degree. You see? So this, we touched upon principle of uncertainty, which is, effectively speaking, the language as far as the manifested realm of creation is concerned. And the certitude only in that what makes us immortal in a sense of who we are. Our essence is not subject of coming and going. So that certainty is the only certainty that is required. Then, with that certainty, the principle of uncertainty is a play, interplay, You see? And that's what makes the big difference. So like knowing the plot, right? Then some important ingredients are pulled out of that. Knowing is then, well, kind of defeats the purpose of, forgive me, thrill, right? The unknowing is in a way becomes that what we wake up to. Wake up literally, not just wake up as a grand concept. Wake up every day, waking up to the unknown. And that there is this beauty of renewal, newness, this continuity, which at the very same time is never the same. So this is what I'm more leaning towards rather than giving it an intellectual blanket or intellectual insight that, which in itself, of course, also an intellectual insight. So there's no way out of that, right?
No, but there's even just the sorry to interrupt, but like the like when you watch a movie for the first time, there's always that it was the first. I remember the first time. You know, it's like the experience is that much richer. You know, whereas when you watch it the second time, you're watching it for some other reasons. You know?
Yes, that's
But
a
the
good analogy.
experience
Yeah, I like
is
that
not
very
as
much.
visceral.
Yeah.
Is not as visceral.
Yes, providing the movie is good. If the movie is good, you can always watch it as if for the first time, even if you know the so-called plot.
So true.
To me, also the best movies they do not have a distinctive plot. They don't have something to tell. In a sense, by the time I finish the movie, the line is completed. The great works of art, to me, have something which, by virtue of them being a form, in itself becomes sufficient. And that's what makes it into watchable many times. You see? Right? Like it doesn't become boring because it is infused and has that form which has the capacity to bring forth a certain response.
Yeah, as you're describing that, I'm contemplating it as less particulate and more wave-like in its nature. And I've had some experience of this with. I'm almost embarrassed to admit I never really understood art, and I probably still don't, to be honest. But it was only about it's probably about 6 odd years ago, 7 odd years ago. I carried a piece of music that was my old mentor's her favorite song, and I learned to play it. And certain lines in the song meant one thing prior to her passing, and it was the same lines in the same song, and the meaning just it just completely changed. And I recognized that I saw myself reflected back differently in the poetry. It was the same words, but I was different before, after, and it wasn't. There was like a wave-like nature to that particular piece of poetry. It hadn't collapsed into particle. It was very much alive in that way.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time we have. I've meandered us a little bit. The yogi, and this is closing, starting to come into this, I don't want to say the words right relation. There's a relation, there's an awareness of the why behind the object and seeing the essence behind the object. From here, people tuning into the podcast will be looking for something a little bit further and practical to do. Now, I know there's a whole body of work that you have around this. Maybe you can introduce us to the body of work and just share how people can find out more if they want to find out more. And then also if there's any last little bits you'd like to share in terms of how one can, walking away from this podcast, just I don't want to say take it on a little bit more practically, because that makes it sound like it hasn't been practical, but to approach the work with more openly, more readily, from this conversation, from where we've been.
Yes, sure. Well, the most, let's say, the easiest and most immediate step one can take if one feels in resonance is to simply check us out on our platforms, from YouTube to whatever else our team, right, offers that on Instagram. We offer online gatherings like in the form of Q&As. Sometimes there are lapses due to travels, but we came back now, so we've got. We will try to keep it more or less on a regular basis, and that's the easiest way to, let's say, to connect for the first time. And then, of course, there are live programs. This work is offered in live settings above all else. And for those who cannot travel, if it's, let's say, too far to travel, and there are online programs that are offered on the website. We are now in the process of creating this online program, which is a result of what could be spoken of as an experiment conducted in Mexico in our last 10-day immersion there in early February, end of January, early February 2025, which was properly filmed. And it's kind of interesting fusion between what always served as an umbrella for the teaching in terms of its philosophical outline that is rooted in KashmirShaivism, the highest tantra of what often referred to in India and outside, and the aforementioned today a few times Patanjali Sutras. So there is this attempt of bringing together these very two different on the outside disciplines into one framework. And of course, it's all conducted in a way as a practice-based. So it's not a theory, or not just theory. It's all based on practical application. So we are happy that we're going to launch this program sometimes early April. And another very big project that we've been working for many, many years and now for many months to its completion is the publication of the book, thick manual, entitled Kundalini. And so that's scheduled end of spring. So we're planning to release that, hopefully in May, all subject to some of the logistics. But the page is already out there for the book itself. It's already announced, and it's just the final steps before we put it into the printing. So there's a lot more one can find out, but these are, let's say, immediately what comes to mind.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'll put a link to everything as it emerges. For those that are tuning in, trust that if you're listening to this after the fact and programs out, books out, there will still be a link in the show notes below. We do that due diligence here, making sure that things are accessible for you as required. Igor, it was only 3 months ago that you were on the podcast, and we talked about a variety of different things. And we're here today talking about and somehow every time we connect, I feel like we're still we go super deep, and yet it seems like we are still scratching the surface in many ways. I want to thank you so much for your generosity, the abundance of the way you share what you share. I think there's a big piece for me personally, which I've reflected to on numerous occasions, the integrity with which you carry your work, especially being Indian by nature, having, someone reflect back Indian values, Indian systems, and learning about them from you has been incredibly profound for me. So thank you so much for your time, your energy here today. And thank you so much for you. Truly treasure you. Thank you, brother.
As they say, the joy is all mine. So thank you, Amrit, for creating this space, and for doing what you're doing. And it's a true honor, and to participate, in whatever way into that, what is very, very rich offering that your channel is becoming more and more known for. I'm really, really impressed. I have to confess.
Thank you for your blessings. It means a lot coming from you. It really does.